The scientific name for vitamin B12 is cobalamin. The name reflects the word cobalt, and cobalt is the metal which has to be at the center of every vitamin B12 molecule. Whereas the other vitamins are made by bacteria and through enzymatic processes in the bodies of plants and animals, vitamin B12 can only be made by microorganisms. The anaerobic and aerobic bacteria, which know how to make this vitamin, are free living in the air, freshwater, saltwater, soil, and the guts of all animals from insects to whales. If you think about a little animal like a mosquito, it's really hard to imagine that it even has intestines, but even more remarkable is the fact that inside the intestines of a mosquito, there is living a vitamin B12 producing bacteria called Clostridium sticklandii. All of the bacteria which know how to make this vitamin have very long names, but they are very uneducated. So it's remarkable that these vitamins and that these microorganisms in the course of their daily life are making the single most complex, naturally occurring, non-polymeric substance ever discovered on planet Earth. Construction of the vitamin from the carbrinic acid skeleton to the finished molecule is a complex set of 190 steps. No amount of human intellect or artificial intelligence can duplicate this feat. Supplemental vitamin B12 is made by farming the bacteria which know how to create the vitamin. Vitamin B12 was the last of the vitamins to be discovered and likely one of the first or the first to come into existence. According to the phylogenetic record, it's older than the ancient protein called hemoglobin. It came into being before the animal kingdom, before the plant kingdom, before the kingdom comprised of fungi. Its initial purpose, aside from meeting a nutritional requirement of the bacteria which was making it, its initial purpose was to promote the emergence of the life kingdom immediately above the level of bacteria. The name of this life kingdom is Protista, and it is comprised of algae from the smallest microscopic one-celled microalgae to the giant kelp. The lowest level of the Protista kingdom is the phylum called diatoms. Diatoms currently live in the soil and fresh water, as well as in the ocean. But on Earth, near the beginning of time, their only environment was the ocean because the land had not yet emerged. It is the function of diatoms to remove carbon dioxide from their environment. They use it to make food for themselves and oxygen for all the aerobic species of life. Additionally, the saltwater diatoms have the job of sequestering huge amounts of excess carbon and placing it into storage in the deepest parts of the ocean. Although no one understands the why of this issue, diatoms are vitamin B12 dependent. You may have heard that large populations of diatoms are disappearing and that this disappearance impacts the amount of oxygen in our air. Climate scientists ascribe this change to the increased acidity of freshwater lakes and rivers or rising temperatures in the ocean. Meanwhile, the vitamin B12 researchers have been tracking diatom populations as well as the B12 concentrations at very exact longitudinal and latitudinal spots in various bodies of fresh and salt water. They've done this over a period of many decades. These vitamin B12 researchers tell us that the diatom populations are decreasing in tandem with decreased levels of vitamin B12 in the natural environment. They will also tell you that the death of the diatoms is the cause rather than a symptom of climate change. I'm mentioning this now because humans have a tendency to think of everything in terms of themselves. On the topic of vitamin B12 deficiency, the issue isn't about omnivore versus vegan humans. It's more of an environmental, planetary catastrophe. In humans, vitamin B12 has a role in 3 enzymatic processes associated with amino acid metabolism. It also works to break up thiamine, used thiamine, a DNA component, and it breaks up used uracil, an RNA component. The vitamin additionally has a detox function relative to excess cholesterol, as well as odd-numbered and branch-chain fatty acids. When I think about the role of vitamin B12 in supporting the work of the diatoms, which manufacture Earth's oxygen, I'm thinking that the vitamin's most essential function involves some primary interaction between cobalt and iron for the purpose of cellular oxygenation. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that cobalt, all by itself, triggers formation by the kidneys of the hormone called erythropoietin. And erythropoietin is the hormone that triggers the formation of red blood cells inside the bone marrow. And the red blood cells are the ones that carry the iron, which carries the oxygen. You've probably heard that every front has a back. In the context of environmental degradation, vitamin B12 is now one of 3 natural substances which promotes the biomethylation of heavy metals. The list of poisons which enter the bodies of plants and animals with the assistance of this vitamin now includes arsenic, mercury, and tin. The human daily need for vitamin B12 is calculated as 2.4 micrograms. A microgram is a millionth of a gram. The total amount in the human body is estimated between 2 and 5 milligrams. A milligram is 1,000th of a gram. If you compare 2 to 5 milligrams of vitamin B12 against the same body's 140 grams of potassium, or 92 grams of sodium, or 110 grams of chloride, you can see that the amount of the vitamin in the human body is close to nothing. Due to its importance and relative environmental scarcity, mammals were designed with a special capture and delivery system. In the mouth, proteins called haptochlorin would bind themselves around the vitamin to protect it from hydrolysis in the stomach. These proteins were digested in the small intestine, freeing up the vitamin for bonding with intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor was or is a glycoprotein made in the stomach. Its purpose is to protect the vitamin B12 in the small intestine and bring it to a receptor, which is especially designed to take in the vitamin bound by intrinsic factor to take it from the gut into the blood. The binding of the vitamin by an intrinsic factor is dependent on an alkaline pH in the ileum between 6.5 and 10. Absorption of the vitamin bound by the intrinsic factor requires the presence of calcium and magnesium. In the blood, the vitamin is carried by binders. They are called transcobalamin 1, 2, and 3. In the event of large supplemental doses, 1 to 3% of the vitamin can be absorbed by simple diffusion. This process is independent of gut pH or calcium or magnesium. It is promoted by the presence of iron and vitamin B6. Once it's inside the body, vitamin B12 is stored in the vital organs, including the bone marrow, brain, heart, kidneys, liver, pituitary gland, placenta, and spleen. In connection with where the vitamin's stored, I'm going to do a quick sidetrack and tell you that in pregnancy, at the time of delivery, a woman's nearly total vitamin B12 supply is in the placenta and the cord blood. This makes it very important for the infant to receive the cord blood. Mammals, including primitive humans, ate the placenta after delivery for the purpose of recapturing the vitamin B12. When I was pregnant with my first baby in the 60s, there was a book circulating among my hippie tribe that actually gave a recipe for cooking the placenta so that it could be eaten by the woman and shared with her family. In macrobiotics, the consumption of koi koku after delivery accomplishes the same function. This is because the carp used to make that soup is cooked whole with all of the vital organs intact. Forgive me. Okay, going back to the trajectory of vitamin B12 in the body, I'll mention that during the digestion of a meal, the vitamin gets dumped into the gut from the liver as a component of bile. And once it's in the gut, pancreatic enzymes digest the transcobalamin, protecting the vitamin, and that frees it up for rebonding with intrinsic factor. This enterohepatic recirculation of vitamin B12 is one of the means by which nature designed for us not to become deficient in this vitamin. You have probably heard that each of the vitamins was discovered in the context of its disappearance from the food chain. For example, the discovery of thiamine or vitamin B1 was initiated when rice-eating populations switched to the use of polished rice and developed the disease called beriberi. Vitamin B12 was the last of the vitamins to be discovered. By 1948, the year of its discovery, the vitamin was rapidly disappearing from the natural environment and food chain due to the chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides, which were introduced into American agriculture at the end of World War II. These substances immediately decreased the level of vitamin B12 in the natural environment by endangering the health or life of the vitamin B12 synthesizing microorganisms. This issue was exacerbated between 1948 and the present time by the introduction of antibiotics. Antibiotics enter the environment via the excretions of humans and farmed food animals. The contribution to the natural environment is measured in hundreds of thousands of yearly tons. Additionally, since the beginning of the 90s, the use of glyphosate in connection with GMO production, the use of glyphosate added to the problem. Glyphosate was originally patented as a broad spectrum antibiotic. Antibiotics kill bacteria, and it should be obvious that dead bacteria can't make anything. It should also be obvious that microorganisms which are confused or poisoned or too sick to complete a process which requires 190 steps, that they will become lazy. They might grab some metal, any metal, to put at the center of the core and ring, or they could start to take shortcuts to the development of the vitamins 4 side chains. These pretend forms of vitamin B12 are called analog. By the early 50s, they showed up in the dairy foods. Here, I'm going to take a brief step to present time. Very recently, researchers have verified that the production of vitamin B12 analogs inside the rumen of dairy cows rises in tandem with increased levels of protein given to the animal. This is what happens when you take a diet, an animal which was historically eating a very low protein, high cellulose, wild grass diet, and you force that animal to eat corn and soybeans and the ground up remains of other animals. So as soon as the researchers discovered vitamin B12 analogs in dairy foods, they started to find them in chicken, beef, pork, and seafood. Research in the early years on 8 species of edible sea vegetables documented no analogs. Changes in the food chain led to changes in humans. By 1970, research with omnivorous humans documented 1 part true B12 in beef liver, in human liver, compared to 9 parts analog. For human blood, the findings were 60% true B12, 40% analog. By the early 90s, the 40% analog in human blood was calculated to be as high as 90%. And in current time, based on skimming the most recent materials, I found out that scientists are now trying to prove that analog B12 is good for humans. Of course, there were danger signs along this path. For example, in the early 80s, one researcher who was trying to verify the vitamin B12 level in the breast milk of omnivorous mothers discovered that 8 out of the 21 women he was working with were putting out breast milk that contained absolutely zero vitamin B12. Rather than sound the alarm, this researcher quietly hid his discovery by switching his assay method to a bioassay that registered vitamin B12 analog as well as B12 as B12. In this way, he was able to document the supposed presence of vitamin B12 in the milk put out by each of these 21 omnivorous mothers. At the same time, the amount was way lower than the RDIs, the recommended daily intake for infants. So he suggested that the RDIs, even though they were just truly very small, were too high. Decreased vitamin B12 levels in the food chain reflected changes in the so-called food animals. Understanding this topic requires just a brief overview of the development of vitamin B12 assay methods. The vitamin was discovered originally with the assistance of a bacteria called Lactobacillus dorner. When this organism began to give inconsistent findings, such as reduced vitamin B12 content for the same food, it was switched to Lactobacillus leishmani, and that was quietly switched at a later point to Lactobacillus delbrueckii. And I don't actually know, I don't think it's available to know what bacteria is currently the government's official assay, and not able to know the level at which it's been genetically modified. The bioassays were very time consuming. They were a big hassle. So what happened was that the laboratories that normally did all kinds of testing started to farm out the vitamin B12 testing to labs which only specialized in vitamin B12 testing. Radioassay was developed as a means of avoiding the hassle and expense of working with living organisms. In its earliest form, radioassay used haptocorin, which is the substance in the pig's saliva and in human saliva, which bonds with vitamin B12 to protect it from hydrolysis in the stomach. These radioassays using haptocorin, the findings between them and the bioassays using bacteria, originally they agreed with each other. They agreed until the point at which they didn't. As soon as the radioassay using haptocorin showed higher B12 levels in the blood or the food being tested than the bioassay, researchers understood that the haptocorin from the pigs was bonding to something that resembled B12 but wasn't B12. At that point, the radioassay test was modified. Purified intrinsic factor from farmed food animals was used instead of haptocorin. In the beginning, this improved test using purified intrinsic factor agreed with the bioassays until it didn't. As soon as the purified intrinsic factor radioassay testing showed higher levels of B12 than the bioassay, the researchers knew that intrinsic factor was glomming onto things that appeared to be vitamin B12, but were not, and could not support bacterial growth. The changes in haptocorin and intrinsic factor occurred almost in tandem with morphological changes in dogs, humans, and rats. What happened is that researchers discovered that the production of intrinsic factor was no longer the province of cells in the stomach. They discovered that intrinsic factor was being secreted along the full length of the gut, starting in the mouth. And then the next thing they found out was that the absorption of vitamin B12 at an explicit point in the ileum, what was no longer how things were, because the vitamin bound by intrinsic factor could now be absorbed at multiple sites, again, along the full length of dog, human, and rat guts. The researchers who discovered these accessory sites for the secretion of intrinsic factor and the absorption of the vitamin bound by it, they decided that these accessory sites were always in existence and that prior researchers had missed them because of antiquated test methods. Logically, they knew this wasn't true. For example, if an animal or human stomach was removed, the animal would develop instant vitamin B12 deficiency anemia. And the same thing goes for the small intestine. If the portion of the ileum where the intrinsic factor bound vitamin was absorbed, if that portion of this intestine was removed, the person or the animal would develop vitamin B12 deficiency anemia. And of course, the researchers could have immediately shown what was going on by using the antiquated methods and finding that, yep, these new accessory sites showed up. In this way, they would realize that they were witnessing something akin to an instant evolutionary process. We can do photos 1 and 2. In May of 1988, articles came out in Macronews and East-West Journal challenging the nutritional sufficiency of the macrobiotic diet. At the time, we had been practicing an Ishizuka Osawa Ihara style macrobiotics for 5 years, and I had been teaching the cooking and coordinating a very active macrobiotic potluck group in Salt Lake City since 1986. The East-West article by Jean Bruce was titled The Myth of Vegetarian B12. The Macronews article, Vitamin B12, the little vitamin that can spell big trouble, included feedback from macrobiotic leaders. Herman Ihara observed that he had not encountered, just 1 and 2, not encountered vitamin B12 deficiency in families which used miso soup daily. He said that people who didn't want the soup should eat the tiny dried fishes called Chiramen irico. This made sense considering that Chiramen irico are dried whole and contain all the vital organs in which the vitamin is concentrated. However, at the time, my feeling was that most people practicing macrobiotics were seriously starving for oil and salt. It seemed impossible that they would be attracted to tiny dried fishes. I was worried that vitamin B12 would become the rationale for the increased consumption of animals, especially mammals, to the detriment of the planet and the humans and the food animals. Both articles really were distressing, especially the suggestions that health was jeopardized by a high fiber diet and that sea vegetables had some dangerous downside. I sent a letter to Michael Rosoff, the editor of Macronews, detailing my family's experience with a fairly austere version of macrobiotics. I included the remarkable health and strength of our little daughter. I mentioned the fact that at age 2, she could readily lift a 28-pound full-size concrete block. I also mentioned that she was allowed any quantity of dried and cooked sea vegetables and that a long, wide, hydrated strip of kombu had been her only teething food. She used to crawl with it in her mouth, and she looked like just a little cute animal with a long green tongue scooting along the floor. But by the end of that letter, I was hooked on the vitamin B12 topic. I decided that I wanted to read the research articles that prompted these 2 articles in the macro community. At first, we were driving to Southern Oregon, more than 2 hours from our home to get photocopies. Then I realized I could get articles and textbooks through interlibrary loans. I was surprised to learn that there are books written on nothing else but the vitamin B12 topic. Books like Cobalamin, biochemistry, and pathophysiology. By the summer of 1988, I had developed a list of questions and concerns. Dr. Bonnie Specker had directed the Boston study. On reading it, my heart skipped beats when I saw vitamin B12 values for sea vegetables, which were much higher than the findings for beef liver. My first question to Bonnie Specker was whether or not the 3.9 micrograms per 100 grams was the correct figure, and if so, whether she thought the animals behind those samples of B12 liver were particularly sick or somehow representative of factory farmed animals. Another burning question centered on the elevated urinary methylmalonic acid excretion in infants of omnivorous moms, some of those elevations being almost 6 times higher than the previously established upper limit of normal for that metabolite in infants. After I got Dr. Specker's response affirming the finding of 3.9 micrograms, Gnat, you're getting too far ahead of us. After I got Dr. Specker's response affirming the finding of 3.9 micrograms on 100 grams of beef liver, I sent out letters to various vitamin B12 research specialists asking questions and expressing my concern that vitamin B12 was disappearing from the food chain and that the planet due to our treatment of the food animals and the microorganisms which make the vitamin. I also wrote to the tempeh craftsperson, Seth Tibbetts, the owner of Turtle Soy Dairy, and to 2 of the miso craftspeople in this country, inviting their interest in testing their products using a bioassay based on Acromonas malhumensis, a protozoan commonly recognized as the single most vitamin B12 specific assay available. I also wrote my teacher, Herman Ihara, to share some of the information I was collecting. Okay, Gnat, this is good. We're now on photos 5 and 6, so a little bit back. In September of 1988, one of the vitamin B12 specialists responded to my letter. That man's name was Charles A. Hall, MD, editor of the text called The Cobalamins. Dr. Hall was a highly respected authority in the vitamin B12 research community and director of a large government-owned laboratory devoted to nutrition assessment and research. In part, his letter to me read, I do not consider your position to be radical, and you ask many very sound questions. The research required to answer some of your questions is every bit as important as the research being conducted on other aspects of vitamin B12 metabolism that is currently in progress. There are many factors that determine just what research an investigator gives priority to. We do have a training program for physicians in the field of nutrition, and if one of them should be suited to the topic of vitamin B12 in foods, I would make that suggestion. During the last week in September, I will be attending a symposium on vitamin B12 being held in London. I will discuss your concerns among my colleagues there. Sincerely yours, Charles A. Hall, MD. I should tell you that letter reached me in the darkest of times, almost immediately after I was served with divorce papers. Dr. Hall's apparent respect for my concerns gave me a huge energy infusion, and it helped me go forward. It also served as something of a formal introduction between me and that part of myself that I didn't realize loved biology. Dr. Hall remained my respondent until his death from cancer in the summer of 1991. I tried to entice him into entering the macro community vitamin B12 fray. He didn't have the time for that, but he read the research published about the Boston and Netherlands communities. His comment was that the experiments were poorly designed and that no conclusions could be drawn from either one. His letter to me was followed by one from Seth Tibbett. This is photo 7, Gnat. This is good. Different batches of Seth's tempeh had been tested using Acromonas malamensis and Lactobacillus leishmani, the official government assay. The vitamin B12 findings were between 4.33 and 5.5 micrograms per 4-ounce serving, which is the same as 100 grams. This seemed like a great beginning towards my goal to prove that vegetarian B12 was not a myth. In the spring of 1989, I attended the Pacific Macrobiotic Conference organized by Cara Bursell and hosted by my teacher's school in Oroville, California. In those days, this was a big conference rather than a group of a few people meeting in the living room. There were maybe 70 people in attendance. On the afternoon of April 1st, Herman Ihara was talking to the group when someone asked a question about vitamin B12. My mind was just totally, completely blown when Herman called me by name to come out of the audience and talk to the group. I went on extemporaneously for about 15 minutes. And when Cora Bursell sent out his summary of this conference to all the participants, he mentioned my talk and he gave people my address in case they wanted to participate in a fairly invasive vitamin B12 dietary questionnaire, which I had created. My contacts at that conference included Jean Richardson, owner of Goldmine Natural Foods, and it led to me being contacted by Mark Mead, the author of the Macromuse 1988 article. He wanted to interview me and he proposed that the interview would be published in Solstice, the macro periodical, which filled the gap which was created when Michael Rosoff stopped production of Macromuse. By that point, I had developed the idea to fund some food tests using Acromonas malamensis. I wanted to compare the vitamin B12 values established for different animal foods, which were recorded near the beginning of vitamin B12 research using this absolutely vitamin B12 specific assay. I wanted to compare what they were then and what they are now. After searching, this is photos 8 and 9. After searching, I discovered a lab in California which had experience with that bioassay. I paid the director to purchase random samples, beef heart, chicken breast, and Swiss cheese from LA supermarkets and to test them for vitamin B12 content. The results of those assays reached me in August 1989, a few days after my 44th birthday. They verified no vitamin B12 content for any of the 3 foods. Although the official report states that the test was conducted twice, the director confided to me that the lab had repeated the test more than twice, procuring new batches of the assay organism at their own expense. He also confided to me that another customer had ordered the same assay for hamburger and obtained the same 0 vitamin B12 findings. I sent copies of that report to a number of my respondents, including Mark Mead. The sensational findings resulted in an article by Mark Mead titled, "Where's the B12?" We're at photos 11 and 12 now. Where's the B12? That article included portions of the original interview. It was published in the February 1990 issue of Solstice. Solstice subsequently published follow-up notes from me in the form of letters to the editor, or vitamin B12 updates. Those articles resulted in me and Olga being invited to my teacher's summer camp called French Meadows, our costs to be paid by me, lecturing on my pet topic. Months before the camp, I wanted to be sure of my perspective, and I decided to follow through on the beef heart assay to see if there was a difference between the beef heart of an animal raised without antibiotics and the zero finding on a commercially raised animal. I was able, this is photo 10. I was able to locate an antibiotic-free beef heart, and I sent it to the lab in California. I also asked the director to go out and obtain samples of beef liver from the LA supermarkets and test that food also. The results reached me in March 1990. Good night, we're up to photo 10, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, we have to, I'm sorry, I haven't corrected these photos. So I can't tell it to you. I haven't corrected my copy. Okay, the lab in California tested the beef heart of an animal raised without antibiotics and got a finding of 2.19 micrograms per 100 grams. That was a lot more than the zero for the commercially raised beef heart, but it was 1/7 of the original finding using Acromonas malhamensis for beef heart. The results on the liver assay showed zero vitamin B12. By this time, I was beginning to realize that the disappearance of the vitamin wasn't really a secret. This started with the pet food for cats and dogs. Even the best of these foods created from the vital organs that aren't used by humans for eating, the vital organs of the food animals, that they didn't contain enough vitamin B12. So the manufacturers of pet food were adding supplemental B12 and listing it as a separate ingredient. The same thing for formula. Baby formula based on dairy milk was being supplemented with vitamin B12. I don't think either of these industries would have spent a penny they didn't have to spend. So it seems that adding supplemental vitamin B12 as well as several other vitamins is something they have to do to protect themselves from being sued by the angry owners of sick pets or sick moms with sick babies. At the same time, I discovered that cold cereals were likely the food which was most helping to keep Americans and especially American children healthy. I tested one of them, a cereal called Total. Like the rest of the cold cereals that clearly listed supplemental vitamin B12 as an ingredient, it claimed 21 micrograms per 100 grams, but it actually came in higher using Acromonas malhamensis, came in at 26 micrograms per 100 grams. Okay, I'm sorry, I haven't corrected any of mine, and I don't know how to go to my documents to correct it. So I won't pay attention to the photos. Now that I knew where Americans were and were not getting their vitamin B12, I decided to obtain some values on sea vegetables. I used a lab on the East Coast, which specialized in the use of Acromonas malhamensis bioassay. Labs received in February, March, and May of 1990 showed values of 9.8 for kombu, 82 for nori, 8.1 for wakame, 26.6 for chiramaniriko, and 1.9 for makabu. The effort to condense vitamin B12 findings into French Meadow lectures was a nightmare. When I pared it down, it resulted in 4 hours split into 2 parts. Vitamin B12, is there a problem? Vitamin B12, is there a solution? In 1993, I added a third lecture called Eating Animals, Ethics, Economics, Environmental Impact, and Human Health. In the summer of 1991, Jean Richardson published my fairly comprehensive overview in an article titled Vitamin B12, a Disappearing Act, question mark. This was published in Goldmine Gazette in the summer of 1991. It was copyrighted under my name and the name of Jane Richardson, owner of Goldmine Natural Foods. 1991 was the year that I formally registered the Vitamin B12 Project with the state of Utah and as a nonprofit organization. Positive assays showing the decline of vitamin B12 in the food animals and those proving true B12 in tempeh and sea vegetables were encouraging. However, the project ran into problems with miso and shoyu. Finally, one of the lab directors told me the issue was the salt. At that point, I switched to a mechanical method called high-performance liquid chromatography, hoping that this would override the salt issue with biological organisms. The director over at Western Analytical told me that with both the miso and the soy sauce, a large heavy column was eluding next to where vitamin B12 was supposed to be. He believed it was the B12 and that it was blocked from showing up, again, by the salt concentration. He sent me a clear and relatively inexpensive proposal to cover the development of a procedure which would remove enough salt from the miso or shoyu to get an accurate vitamin B12 reading. I recently ran across that proposal and can tell you I was a fool not to follow through on the research he proposed. I'm going to get to takeaways now, what I've come away with from all of this. Relative to supplements, before the 1993 lectures at French Meadows, I had received lab reports showing very, very high and very, very, very low vitamin B12 findings for the same sea vegetable from the same country, but harvested in different seasons. It turned out that vitamin B12 concentrations in the ocean are temperature dependent. At that point, I relented on the topic of supplements. If you're going to use them, the recommended ones would be adenosylcobalamin or methylcobalamin. The most common supplement, cyanocobalamin, is made when humans use cyanide to separate the vitamin from the organism which makes it. Cyanocobalamin is not it is inert inside humans until and unless the cyanide is split off. Relative to blood tests, I'm pretty sure that research labs have developed and are using a lab test which does not misidentify analog B12 as the real deal. I'm just as sure that this method will never be used by any commercial lab. The most I can say is that if an individual is avoiding animal food, the vitamin B12 level in their blood is most likely true B12 and not analog. To my mind, it's preferable to have very low serum vitamin B12. If it is B12, that would be very preferable to a high vitamin B12 level, which is mostly analog of the vitamin. Relative to sea vegetables, this should be photo 20. More than 50% of the species of algae studied to date have a vitamin B12 requirement. They use the vitamin for one of the same enzymatic pathways as humans. In some phylums, such as Rhodophyta or the red algae, nearly all species tested are vitamin B12 dependent. These guys acquire the vitamin from the water or soil in which they live. Some of them actually incorporate the vitamin B12 synthesizing bacteria into their own bodies, where they coexist in a symbiotic relationship. But whether or not the sea vegetables contain vitamin B12, they are a valuable source of minerals. Sea vegetables are traditionally cooked with miso, salt, or shoyu. And this is important because sodium is the molecule which escorts calcium from the gut into the blood. And calcium is a critical cofactor in at least one of the vitamin B12 needful enzymatic processes. Many people are afraid of sea vegetables because of the environmental pollutants which they contain. I'm here to tell you that humans cannot digest the colloids, which are specific to each of the edible sea vegetables. These colloids, which attract heavy metals and radiation and all kinds of garbage from the ocean, continue to act as chelating agents inside the guts of animals. And then they're excreted, and assuming that they are not busted up by chemicals at a water treatment plant, they would go back into the environment, and these colloids would continue to attract garbage to themselves. But we don't digest these colloids, so the content of the heavy metal content of hijiki, it's a non sequitur. Okay, the original articles made people afraid of fiber and led to the increased use of pasta, sieved grain, and sourdough bread. It turns out that the fiber which everyone needed to be wary of was the soluble fiber called pectin. Using rats as surrogate humans, researchers found that as little as 5% pectin in a period of weeks caused elevated urinary methylmalonic acid excretion 9 to 21 times higher than that of the fiber-free group. By contrast, the non-soluble cellulose fiber content of a diet had to be pushed to 40% to achieve even a doubling of the UMMA. Similarly, rats fed 40% cellulose diet excreted much less vitamin B12 during the enterohepatic recirculation of the vitamin than the fiber-free group, whereas rats fed as little as 10% pectin excreted much more vitamin B12. Diet is always a gestalt. The people in colder climates who use the most animal-sourced foods were also eating grains such as oats, which were higher in soluble fiber. Soluble fiber in their grains and the regular consumption of fruits promoted the excretion of excess cholesterol, branched-chain fatty acids, and odd-numbered fatty acids, which the people ingested while eating the flesh of the animals. The pectin also promoted the excretion of vitamin B12, but that didn't matter because there was more vitamin B12 to be had with the next meal. Seeing as how times have changed, it seems potentially useful to support the production of vitamin B12 by the bacteria which live in our gut. I'm going to jump ahead and tell you that all this nonsense about how we can't absorb the vitamin B12 made by the bacteria in the colon has been disproven. Radio-labeled vitamin B12 has been administered via suppository, and it ends up almost immediately in the blood of the human test subject. At any rate, the bacteria, which adequate salt in the diet supports the work of beneficial gut bacteria. It suppresses the growth of pathogens. Cellulose makes the good guys very happy. research, supporting the health and well-being of endogenous vitamin B12 gut-producing gut bacteria is important. By contrast, because the animal kingdom is the only one in which environmental poisons are bio-magnified, as well as bioaccumulated and bioconcentrated, because of conditions in the animal, the increased use of animal food to get fat or salt or vitamin B12 seems hopelessly misguided. I totally apologize for me skipping ahead and then not finding myself at the ending. I'm going to let it go there with love and hugs.
Super
I don't know if any questions came in. I want to tell you guys that none of the testing, none of the food testing was a trick. None of the test samples were doctored in any way. And yeah, I'll just put that out there. Oh, I'll also say that I have a very open mind. Unlike the very hardcore vegans in the macrobiotic community, my philosophy accepts the use of animal foods as a form of medicine eating. And for instance, in the case of the koi koku soup after the delivery of a baby. Have I entirely lost you guys?
No. Can you hear me?
I
Sylvia, I have a question.
All right, Ellen.
Oh, yeah. By the way, thank you. That was really, really interesting.
Did anybody even follow any part of it?
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
Absolutely.
Ellen, thank you so
Well, I'm a
much.
dietitian, so I'm kind of.
I'm just wonderfully gratified. I can't begin to tell you.
No, and I'm super into seaweed, and if I might call it seaweed, but yeah, but I feel like well, I do have one question.
You have wonderful eyebrows, by the way. That's a sign of a strong constitution. I'm totally jealous. Yeah. How can I steal Ellen's eyebrows? Ah!
Thank you. You flatter me. So, okay, so here's my question. So since widespread B12 deficiency, what is your ultimate recommendation? I see what you're saying, soluble fiber for the bacteria, but
No,
also the source like seaweed, right?
No, insoluble, not soluble.
Oh, insoluble.
Not soluble fiber, like
Okay.
cellulose. You do
Okay.
not want the soluble fiber like pectin.
Well,
That's
it's good.
the one that promotes the excretion of the vitamin.
It's a mixed blessing. But
Yeah.
okay, but so you need the soluble for the
Well,
micro.
yeah, but see, promoting the increased excretion of the vitamin didn't matter at all for the people that were eating animal foods up in Ireland and Scotland. They were also eating their sea vegetables like the Irish moss and dulse and so on. In fact, as far as sea vegetables go, every country in the world that had a coast, including like Africa, the countries of South America, the Scandinavian countries, all of them ate sea vegetables as part of their primitive to traditional cuisine.
Okay. So you just have.
So I'm recommending a diet high in cellulose like rice, low in pectin like fruit.
And which sea vegetables do you recommend? And how much if that's not crazy?
That cannot be known because the rapidity at which the vitamin is disappearing from the environment, and I haven't done any testing since the first half of the 90s. And it's, I can't even go near the boxes, which include all the dozens of assays by high performance liquid chromatography. Some of them were swamped when a water heater in the basement broke and flooded boxes and so on. But no, I haven't done any testing, and I don't know that there is any assay that is like currently specific being used. So you couldn't even get a research lab to be interested in this topic.
What a, that's your granddaughter that was chewing on these
No,
vegetables?
that was my child. My child was raised on sea vegetables in large quantities. At the time of the 1988 macro community vitamin B12 brouhaha, she was a toddler.
Sylvia,
Yes.
this is
Hey,
Mike.
Mike. Hey, Maria.
Hi, Sylvia.
Sylvia,
Yeah.
Here's the bottom line question: the disappearance of B12 from the environment, is it a yin or a yang phenomenon?
Oh, the vitamin is yang, the disappearance is yin. Anytime that you have a breakdown of a system to support life, and in this case, this is the system to support life of all aerobic species. The diatom's dependence on vitamin B12 in the natural environment is the foundation of organic life on Earth. Organic life on Earth is the body, a single body of which we are individual cells and part of a specialized tissue called humans. That body, the existence of it, is collapsing because of what we have done to the microorganisms, the bacterial kingdom, at the basis of all of the kingdoms above them. And isn't this amazing that the first would be last and the last would be first in terms of importance? I was so blown away by this topic that it became like an addiction or a disease for me. In 1990, 2 people begged to help me put things into writing. One of them was the head of the University of Utah Press. It was a man with a background in science, and he had heard the lecture actually several times because Olga and I rode with him when we went to the first French meadows that we attended in 1990. He was a member of our macrobiotic community. He begged me more than once to let him help me make a book, and I couldn't, because if I'm studying and writing, I seriously couldn't do anything except study and write and smoke. I was a mother, and I was responsible for cats, multiple cats and dogs. I had, we were doing takeout meals. I was doing cooking classes. We were doing vegetarian bed and breakfast and so on. I couldn't be a writer because being a writer, I had to be like in a cave and not do any of this stuff. I especially couldn't fast when I was responsible for cooking for a child. So the other person was Roger Windsor. And at the time he was the editor of an alternative health magazine called Spectrum. And he asked me to please do a pamphlet. He said he would help typeset it. He wanted me to have it published by Herman Ihara's George Osawa Macrobiotic Foundation Press. And he said we could advertise it in Spectrum and East West Journal. But I couldn't do that either. In fact, just going near these boxes like triggers PTSD for me, to the extent that it's only because of this lecture that I forced myself to go back to 1995 and try to look at some of the pages which weren't damaged by the flood or insects. But yeah, it became like a disease. It became like an addiction. And I'm really lucky. It helped me get through a really traumatic divorce, among other things.
Well, you are a writer, but if you wrote any of that, it was so well put together. But I have one more
I
question.
wrote all of that and I screwed up.
Awesome stuff, truly. You are a writer, but you're probably a perfectionist. But one last question for me.
Yeah,
Exactly. One last question is, so do you take a vitamin supplement?
I do.
Can I ask you which one? Which brand?
It's methylcobalamin.
Well, no, that's the vitamin, but a brand?
Oh, I had no idea. I don't know anything about this. I usually
Oh,
go with
okay.
what's least expensive.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay.
Ellen, thank you for the feedback.
Oh,
It's like
I
wonderful.
thought you didn't write this stuff. I'm thinking that was like really good. All
It's
right.
wonderful
You
to
did.
know that anybody's interested in it. When I was active in the topic, I was just desperate to discuss it with people that could discuss it with me.
There's one more speaker that I've heard, and actually Ginat, she did something on seaweed, and you know she's been on a couple of talks, and she's awesome. Jane Tees, right?
Teas, right, for sure.
You guys should meet.
I've had her on the program.
Sylvia.
She's
No, you
been on
have.
the forum.
No, I'm talking to
All
Sylvia.
right.
But yeah, thanks. Okay, bye everybody.
Can't hear you, Ellen.
I went on mute. I'm sorry. I thought I'd spoken quite enough.
No, you're the only one talking, so I
Oh,
wish
see-
other people would talk.
so Sylvia, Jane Tees, you should look her up.
Uh,
Awesome community there. Bye. Thanks again. I'm hanging up now. You.
So anything else?
Let's
So
look at,
I just
You
want
know-
to add,
yeah,
Sylvia, I just want to add that, we have another conference coming up in July, sponsored by Planetary Health.
yes,
in-
I know this group.
Yeah, and so I'll bring this subject up during a moment there. See if there's some awareness.
Actually, there was a point at which Ed Esco approached me more than once for using the assays. And that was during a period where I wasn't having any contact with this topic and couldn't respond favorably.
But the whole project, you could have a collaborator and start it all over again, and
But I'm a few months from my 78th birthday, and actually from 1 hour to the next, I don't absolutely know that I'm going to be still breathing. So
No,
it's
it wouldn't.
unlikely.
Yes, Sylvia, what I'm saying is if you had a collaborator who would be doing the work and just based on.
Okay, yeah, I'm open, any collaborator. I was an idiot that I didn't know how to be less of an extremist back in the early 90s.
Right.
Because right now, of course, I have to feed my pigeons every day. We haven't missed a day since August of 2012. And I do that for the purpose of giving the universe a reason to keep me alive. And during the periods where I was out of town or not able to go out of the house, I paid somebody to do this for me.
Yeah.
And besides that, I take care of the inside and outside cats. I feed the squirrels and raccoons. I cook food for myself and make myself eat, though my family is saying this isn't enough food or not the right kind of food. Because one of my problems when I'm writing, I told you I have a tendency to forget about eating, to fast, and that's right now dangerous for me.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'll keep trying to get my weight above 80 pounds
No.
because of this really bad habit
No.
of taking only what's necessary. I found out you can go too far because I was, wanting to be one of these air breathers that only existed on the nutrition in the air. And I fully believe they're doing this, the Janes, but I can't do it because I just lose too much weight.
No, no.
Yeah.
So if you could transfer those files to your collaborator and
None of
perhaps.
them, all of them were created before I was into computers.
Hmm.
So that's a.
No, they're physical files.
Oh, the physical files.
Yeah. So what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I think somebody would go crazy from
Yeah.
the chaos and disorganization in those boxes. Not to mention the insects, but it's a nice idea. And I love you and I love Maria.
Thank you, Sylvia.
And I
We'll-
would like to be optimistic about this. Maybe at some time I can just, I copyrighted all of the essential ideas back in the early 90s. I
Yeah.
did do that. But so now at this point, I regret some of the things I thought at the time because things have changed so radically much. This nonsense where current day researchers are trying to prove that vitamin B12 analogs are healthy for humans. I mean, this is a far cry from all that nonsense about vitamin B12. Oh, and by the way, they've completely, as of 1989, they had completely refuted the idea that vitamin B12 analogs were being produced endogenously by the microorganisms in the guts of humans.
Yeah.
They had disproven that. And I should tell you about the Bonnie Specker experiment in Boston, because she did something very similar to what that doctor in the early 80s did when he discovered no vitamin B12 in the breast milk of 8 omnivorous breastfeeding moms, 8 out of the 21, no B12. But Bonnie Specker did something of a similar reasoning or non-reasoning. What happened was that the methylmalonic acid, urinary methylmalonic acid excretion in the urine of the infants being nursed by the omnivorous control mothers, when that figure went almost 6 times higher than the upper limit of normal in the reference range for infants for that metabolite, she reasoned to herself, well, these are the infants of omnivorous mothers, so they must be okay. And she went on to suggest that the UMMA reference range for infants was too low, 4 was too low, and that the norm should go as high as 23. And okay, on the topic of radioassay, using purified intrinsic factor for both the Boston and Netherlands community, there was a point because the sea vegetables were so high in B12 and the beef liver was so low, and then supposedly the use of sea vegetables did not produce a hematologic response in one of the or more of the children. The researchers finally let it out that radioassay using purified intrinsic factor was not specific for vitamin B12. It would identify the analog as well as the real vitamin. At that point, the researchers, competent researchers, would have completely stopped and questioned the vitamin B12 levels in the serum, the blood of the moms, because if the radioassay using purified intrinsic factor can recognize analog as true, well, then you have to question the blood findings and you have to question the findings in beef liver, because maybe that's all analog, which showed up in my assays. It came out as 0 using a B12 specific test. But instead, they chose to assume that the radioassay using purified intrinsic factor was picking up analog B12 in the sea vegetables, but true B12 in the serum levels and the beef liver. So this is bias. And there's also a level of mental dissonance where somebody sees the evidence of something and just can't believe it. So completely can't believe it that they can't see it actually.
No.
And the other thing is that the research community is entirely separate from the mainstream America or Europe and so on. The research community has its own knowledge. And that doesn't go out to the public because what would happen? Like panic, right? Well, of course, that stays with them unless somebody from the outside delves in. That's how it is. And another thing here is that here on planet Earth, the dogma that's out there is usually the opposite of the truth. Usually the opposite. So at least you're aware of that, then you investigate further on the various issues. And I was really methodical on this one. And if it had turned out, well, there's no way you could have gotten me to eat mammals no matter what they contained. No way for me to use dairy no matter what it contained. I stopped that in 1983. But for other animals, for instance, my teachers were the Iharas. I originally learned macrobiotics, where included fish, in the occasional use of egg, like in baking, the occasional use of poultry, like for high holidays. That's the macrobiotics that I came into. But the issue with the animal kingdom, again, because it biomagnifies. So what does it mean? Bioaccumulate. An organism picks up like poisons from the environment, bioconcentrate during the course of the organism's lifetime. It is concentrating that environmental poison. Biomagnify is a function of the animal kingdom. Poisons are biomagnified as you go up the animal food chain because animals eat animals. So like, believe it or not, the most polluted food on the planet in the 90s was the breast milk of Inuit women living up near the Arctic Circle, if you can imagine. And the reason it was the most heavy metal poisonous food on the planet, the breast milk of these women, was because they were at the top of the food chain. And that's biomagnification of environmental poison. Anyway, the animal kingdom is the only kingdom that biomagnifies environmental poisons. So this is one of the reasons which led to me going vegan in March of 2012. One of the reasons. It got to the point where just tasting the fish, I would get a sore throat. So I knew something in the fish wasn't for me.
So the Iharas were completely aware of this breakdown in the natural system by the mid-80s.
I can't hear you.
I'm saying the bottom line for the Iharas, because you Herman asked you to make that presentation. They were completely aware of the research indicating the breakdown of the environment, and they were aware of that by the mid-80s.
I actually don't think so. I think the Iharas love me, I love them. And the sensational article that Mark Mead produced in February 1990 for solstice. That made me a good choice for a lecturer at French Meadows Summer Camp. But I don't know if Herman was actually following this topic in
Well,
any
it-
comprehensive way.
uh,
I think
maybe,
it partly had to do with the fact that English is not their normal language. It never was. They never got comfortable with English, unlike the Kushis. And so even for spoken English, and then, yeah, there's things about this. There were points when Herman, I know he heard, because for instance, he sent me a letter asking me to give him the reference on erythropoietin, the hormone manufactured by the kidneys, which promotes the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow. He asked me to give him that reference. So he was following pieces of this.
now, you remember when that was?
I have the letter. I have letters that I sleep under my pillow every
Yeah.
night.
No, he was in the late 80s. He was completely convinced. Herman was. He was completely convinced that within 20 years, this would become completely visible for the world community, for the world population.
Okay, you know that I don't know. The last time I lectured at French Meadows
What is this?
was 1993. And that was
Right.
probably the last time that I was in the same room with or place with the Iharas. Back at the end of 1989, I had them living in my home for 3 days. They were actually eating my food for 3 days, except for the food prepared during the cooking classes, which Cornelia gave at a Buddhist temple where we were renting the kitchen and lecture hall for their workshop. But yeah, they were living in my home and eating my food, which was very brave of me. That's when I forced Cornelia, or asked her to guess how many years I'd been doing the cooking. And she guessed 14. And it was less than 6 years at that point. But I was, my older daughter, who was
Sylvia, I missed that. How many years was it?
I had been doing it for 6 years, but she guessed 14.
Nice.
But the thing is, my oldest child at the age of 16 was invited by her home economics teacher to teach 3 macrobiotic classes in her high school. That's how good she was. And she got a job with a little natural foods restaurant here on the avenues in Salt Lake City, because she's gone on to become a very illustrious vegan chef, vegan macrobiotic. But anyway, she and I, when I first went to Vega and brought home the cookbooks, she and I just went on a marathon of cooking and cooking and cooking and cooking until actually what happened was everything made me nauseous. The smell of broccoli made me nauseous. The smell of brown rice made me nauseous. And I was looking one day in Cornelia's calendar cookbook, and I read that sometimes macrobiotic women, pregnant women, are nauseated by the smell of brown rice. And that's how I found out I was pregnant. But anyway, before that, we were doing a ton of cooking. And after that, we were doing a ton of cooking.
What a story.
Yeah, it was fun. So we're so far past time, aren't we?
Thank you, Sylvia.
Yes.
Hey, Mario, love to you. One of these days, I'd love to talk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I enjoy talking when I have the opportunity.
You had a lot of time on the road to think through a lot of things. And all of us love Osawa. You know, his writing was just terrible. He constantly contradicted himself, but he had such a generous, adventuresome spirit. If you read
Yes.
through the short biography of his life and what happened
Yeah.
what year, the man just was like incredible, always like jumping into the most amazing endeavors that no person in their right mind would attempt. Yeah. So
Yeah,
we have the same source. Osawa is one of several teachers as well as family members for whom I pray every day by name. He's one of them.
yeah,
Along
he
with
was,
my parents and my mentor and children, grandchildren, Osawa.
he was like a grandfather to me.
Interesting thing
George
at
Osawa.
Vega, when I was at Vega, I can't tell you how much the Iharas loved the Osawas. And the students every day, there was a photo of George Osawa at the front of the room. And before we started the chanting, Cornelia would have us say, "Good morning, George Osawa." Because she loved him, and we loved him.
Yeah, George Osawa, he was the most influential person in my life.
That's
Second
what
to my
I
mother.
heard when I listened to you. That's why I mentioned it. Yeah,
Yeah, he was, yeah, he was like a grandfather to me.
yeah, wonderful.
And, yeah, I was 11 years old when he passed away. I have many memories of George and Lima.
And
Sylvia, I want to finish here with someone has written here in the chat. A big thank you to you, Sylvia, for exploding and for powerful information about B12. I haven't heard anything like this. You are amazing.
Oh, thank
with
you so
that,
much.
I'm going to say thank you as well from me and from all of
You're
us.
welcome.